Episode 35, The Cemetery of Luck. We live in a world where working hard doesn't necessarily lead to financial rewards. So there are those who would consider alternative pathways to help them achieve their financial dreams. And an unorthodox route is the lottery. Hopeful individuals purchase a lottery ticket every single day to give them a better chance at financial freedom. This was the case for Ruth, who felt that her job at a fast food joint wasn't getting her anywhere financially. So she began purchasing lottery tickets on a daily basis. And after a couple of years doing so, and to have only won the occasional few dollars that could buy her a meal or two, she became frustrated. Ruth was annoyed from seeing the news about people winning millions of dollars and having their lives changed in an instant. Ruth wanted that stroke of luck as well, and would do anything to get such news blessed upon her. So, one day after she heard from a friend named Clara, who shared that she had heard many had won the lottery after visiting a particular grave in the cemetery, Ruth was all ears. Clara told Ruth that all that the winners did was to visit the grave, whisper a set of prayers, and place raw meat on top of the grave as a form of payment for the spirit, after which the person would have dreams about a set of numbers to buy for the lottery. Clara said that it was a decision that Ruth needed to think hard about, as it was a risky thing to do. Clara explained that the grave belonged to a lady who carried out dark practices when she was alive. Clara also said that the lady had made a fortune from doing so back then. She engaged many evil spirits to help her get rich by either stealing money for her or somehow having her own business prosper. Clara then told Ruth that if she wins the lottery, she would have to give some sort of sacrifice again for the grave. The post-winning sacrifice would be a different offering. If she won, Clara told Ruth that she had to give a bag of human blood and pour it on her grave. Clara emphasized to Ruth again that this needed to be done if she won, and if she didn't do so, it would lead to harsh consequences. Ruth couldn't care less that she would be engaging evil spirits or that she would need to give it blood as a reward. All Ruth thought about was that the opportunity would allow her to finally win the lottery. So it took Ruth merely seconds to make the decision that she wanted to visit the grave. So that same night, Ruth visited the cemetery and stood right in front of the tombstone. It seemed like any other ordinary tombstone, but somehow the aura of it felt uncomfortable and weirdly intense. Undeterred, Ruth proceeded to place the raw meat as how Clara told her, prayed, and left the place. That same night, as she was deep in her sleep, Ruth saw numbers in her dreams, as many others before her did. 4, 4, 6, 8. Those were the numbers that she saw, misty-shaped, but in a very distinct form. So when Ruth woke up in the morning, she quickly took a piece of paper to write it down, as she was afraid that she might forget them. Ruth then got ready and went to submit her lottery numbers at a nearby location. It was a couple of nerve-wracking days for Ruth as she waited for the lottery results to be announced. The day finally came as Ruth sat in her living room while listening intently to the radio. And to her blissful excitement, although she didn't win the grand prize, one of the big winner's numbers were read out: 4, 4, 6, 8. For the first time, she heard her numbers on the radio. Ruth couldn't believe it, that she was finally one of the big winners. The radio then announced the amount of money that the ticket holder would receive. It was $15,000, and at that time, The amount that she won was enough for her to live off of for half a year. Ruth was really happy, and she immediately thought about what she wanted to do with the money. She knew that a vacation was well-deserved after working for so long, but was never able to afford it. She also thought about the new TV that she wanted to buy as well. But as she was daydreaming, Ruth then suddenly recalled what Clara told her about needing to give a bag of human blood to the grave. So Ruth immediately took a knife and brought it along with her as she hurriedly went to the grave to make her payment. Once there, Ruth cut one of her fingers as the wound began to open up and her blood began dripping. With how small the cut was, only a few droplets dropped and sunk into the grave. But as Ruth's finger was beginning to feel numb, and that she no longer was willing to cut a deeper wound on another fingertip, Ruth put the penknife aside and stopped the bleeding by putting a Band-Aid on it before taking her leave. Ruth immediately went home, and as it was already late, she decided to head to bed so that she could wake up early the next day to collect her winnings. However, that night, Ruth dreamt that, as she was dripping her blood into the grave, a figure in red came out of the grave in anger and told her that her blood was not enough. The figure kept on repeating that it was not enough several times. The red figure looked furious, and as it reached out and choked Ruth in her dreams, she was woken up and somehow felt actual pain on her neck. It was as though someone strangled her in real life. As the dream left a bad feeling in her, Ruth texted Clara to let her know what had happened. But as it was late into the night, Ruth didn't receive any reply from Clara. Eventually, Ruth fell asleep again shortly after. Ruth then dreamt of seeing the same red figure again. This time, the red figure was digging up a grave before turning to look at Ruth in her dreams and told her to get inside the grave. Ruth resisted, but she felt a pull and fell into a dark, endless, narrow hole. As she was still falling into the hole, Ruth suddenly woke up from her sleep again. Ruth wondered whether she did something wrong at the grave that caused her to have such nightmares. While still in her thoughts, Ruth looked around her room, and to her horror, she noticed a figure at her door. It was the red figure that she saw in her dreams as it stood there staring at her. Before Ruth could react, the red figure then ran right towards Ruth before she felt herself being strangled for a good few seconds. The figure disappeared shortly after, and Ruth was now completely terrified at what she had experienced. She knew that she had done something wrong and that it had something to do with the grave, possibly not giving it enough blood as a reward. Although it was in the middle of the night, Ruth instinctively got up and drove back to the cemetery. Once there, Ruth was so terrified about the strangling that she felt earlier that she quickly took out a penknife and made a small cut on one of her fingers. As the blood was slowly dripping, Ruth heard a voice in her ear asking her for more and more. Ruth's fears creeped back up on her again as she began creating more wounds from her hands to have more blood drip out. In a couple of minutes, Ruth lost so much blood that she began to lose her consciousness and fainted right beside the grave. Ruth could have almost lost her life that night. But thankfully, Clara wasn't asleep yet when Ruth sent her the text message about her dreams earlier. Upon seeing the text, Clara immediately got up and called a healer who stayed nearby. They knew that Ruth's dreams would eventually endanger her life, and they rushed to the grave. Once there, they saw Ruth lying motionlessly and called for the ambulance. While waiting for help to arrive, the healer poured plenty of spiritual water and buried a pair of scissors right on the grave. In a timely manner, the ambulance came right after. They kept Ruth at the hospital for observations for the night, as Ruth had lost a lot of blood. But as the night turned into dawn, Ruth slowly began regaining her consciousness. Clara and the healer, who stayed outside the observation ward throughout the night, was eventually allowed to enter the room and sat by Ruth's bedside. Ruth then let them know exactly what she experienced earlier. The healer then told Ruth that what she did had offended the spirit of the grave by not giving enough blood. He explained that it was the same as engaging someone for a service and paying them 50 cents after agreeing to pay $100 for it. The healer then said that if a human would get angry over such doings, how much more angry would it be when it was an evil spirit that she was dealing with? The healer then told Ruth and reminded Clara as well that they should never attempt to engage in such dangerous practices again. But the healer also said that, for this particular grave, the evil spirit will no longer be able to exit her grave and haunt Ruth, as the spiritual water and the scissors buried in her grave earlier would trap her within. Feeling how much pain she had to go through, Ruth told herself that she was not willing to experience it ever again. Even if it meant that she would never win the lottery, Ruth was fine with it, as she knew that the situation could have been far worse. Ruth could have cut herself till she lost complete consciousness and died without anyone knowing. Ruth was grateful towards Clara and the healer for taking the initiative to find her. Ruth also completely stopped playing the lottery, as she was worried that she would not be able to control her emotions again, get frustrated, and would resort to such extreme measures again to win. The oddly extreme measures that she took by seeking help from the Cemetery of Luck.